let me share my screen to tell you a little bit what are the things that we are thinking about now and that are keeping us awake at night. So the first one is that we think we need to focus on increasing the efficiency of social distancing. We have social distancing measures in countries that have shown to be extremely costly economically and not very effective in terms of reducing contagion. What we've learned through that experience is that every country is very different. There's no such thing as best practices. That in the U.S. by the month of June, over 40% of the deaths were in nursing homes. In many of the countries that we work on, there is no such thing as nursing homes. In the U.S., you could tell people to stay home and send them a check. Well, in many of these countries, people tend to leave home in order to be able to try to either earn a living or just to buy food. So how you organize these things so that you reduce contagion as people carry on their lives is something that countries need to work on, and they need to sort of like gather the right data and know how to analyze the data that they are gathering. So we think that this is a very important activity because optimistically, we will have vaccinated significant portions of the population, say in a year's time. So that's like twice the amount of time that we have been battling this virus since it was declared a global pandemic. I think countries need to make sure that they get access to a vaccine and they need to work on a vaccination strategy. We wish there was more international coordination and that the World Health Organization would be at the forefront of this, but unfortunately, there hasn't been, the U.S. left the World Health Organization. There hasn't been the focus on making this happen. As Bill Gates likes to say, we're still paying for AIDS and malaria and so on through PEPFAR and other U.S. government programs, but we still don't have an agreement on helping countries finance the purchase of these vaccines and making sure that they get access to it. So I think that the vaccination strategy should be really a very important policy issue. I think that from a point of view of macro management, we have to distinguish the pre from the post-vaccination period. In the pre-vaccination period, we think that we need to be prepared to this stop and go, open and close uncertainty that Lucio was referring to, because countries all want to reopen and recover the economy, but if they lose control of the pandemic, they have to shut down again, as we've seen it happened in Chile. We see it happen several times in Panama and El Salvador. We've seen it happen in Israel. So this period, the pre-vaccination period is going to be always subject to these kinds of potential shocks, and we need to think of that as a special period. And then once the population gets vaccinated, then we can open up more clearly and focus on recovery. I think that the countries are going to need to be able to fund this period. The government has to be fully funded. That they need to get the resources, control of the resources in order to play a positive role. But they also need to signal that in the medium term they'll be good for the money. And so we've been thinking that this is the right time not to impose a tax, but at least to approve a tax to be implemented during the recovery. So we're looking at ways in which we can make a progressive tax reform that, as Lucy also said, it doesn't let the good crisis go to waste, fixes problems that countries have in their current tax structure. In particular, we think that they tend to have very, very low levels of taxation of capital that is limiting, the redistributive function that tax policy could play. And we need to assure that we don't get a crisis from here to there. That very often countries get into these triple crises of a public debt crisis, a banking crisis, and a currency crisis. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. That the economy is adequately protected, because if these crises do happen, they become a problem of their own, and they slow down any potential recovery. And finally, we think that there is a coming equity shortage in firms, that you're going to have firms that have potentially a bright future after the vaccination process, but they'll have very damaged balance sheets. They can borrow, but they're to a limit because they cannot be over leveraged. So we think that the amount of equity in firms is going to become the binding constraint, and we need to be thinking of ways in which we can inject equity in those firms so as to accelerate any recovery that happens afterwards. So those are some of the ideas that we've been focusing on.